Hello, I'm Peter Clausen, photographer extraordinaire! Okay, let's talk about shooting in manual mode, or rather getting correct exposure in manual mode. Oops, wrong slide. My bad. That's the one I want, the exposure triangle. Remember the three amigos? ISO, shutter speed, and aperture? Well, with ISO, the higher the number, the more sensitive your camera will be to light, meaning you can shoot in less light. But you'll have more noise in your photographs. You get more speed, but you also get more noise. It's a trade-off. Now with shutter speed, the higher the number, the faster the speed, meaning the shutter will be open less time and less light will reach the sensor. Now with aperture, the higher the f-stop number, the less light will reach the sensor. Now aperture has a very creative side effect known as depth of field. The higher the f number, the more depth of field you'll have in your photographs. Now no one can tell you what numbers to use exactly because you're the artist and you're creating a photograph. So here's how I like to approach it. First, to decide what kind of photograph do I want. If I want a landscape that's going to be sharp right from the front all the way to infinity, I'll choose an aperture number that is high, such as 16 or even higher. On the other hand, if I want just my subject to be in focus and the background blurred out, I'll choose a small f number such as 4 or 2.8 or even smaller if I can. And I'll use shutter speed and ISO to set up for correct exposure. Let me show you a few examples of what I mean. This first photograph is a classic Sunny 16 rule type landscape. So I set my drive mode to single shooting because I just want to take one shot at a time. I set my autofocus mode to one shot because I know my subject's not going to move and this will allow me to recompose my shot. Set metering mode to evaluative, which I almost always use. I left white balance at auto and set image recording quality to raw, which is by far my favorite. Then ISO to 400 because I know with my camera I'm not going to get a lot of noise at 400. I set shutter speed to 400 because I know that I can hold my camera steady at 400. And then aperture 16 in order to get everything sharp right from the front all the way to infinity. I focused about here and then simply recomposed and took the shot. And here it is. As you can see, everything is clear and sharp, right from the flowers in the foreground to the clouds in the background. And that's what f16 got me. I took this photograph in Cancun, Mexico one evening after the sun had gone down pretty much completely. But it was bouncing all this orange light up into the sky. It was fairly overcast, but the clouds are all orangey in that, and that in turn was bouncing down onto the water here and making it all orangey, and then the city lights were bringing more light onto the water down in here, and I just thought it looked really cool. So set my camera on a tripod so that it will not move, and I set my drive mode to self timer and my autofocus mode to one shot because I wanted to recompose, and my metering I just left at evaluative. I set my white balance to shade because I know that will really bring out all this orangey light bouncing around over here. And of course I almost always shoot in RAW. Now I set ISO to 100 because at long shutter speeds ISO can produce even more noise and I didn't want that. I wanted a 30-second shutter speed because the water is moving around pretty good and it was windy and the clouds are moving, and so I know that if I leave the shutter open 30 seconds, all the things that are moving are going to become soft focused or blurry, if you will. So then that forced me to use an aperture of 4.5, which in this case is fine because I know that all of this is going to be blurry and all the sky is going to be blurry. So I just focused right about here to make sure these buildings are going to be in sharp focus, and then I simply recomposed, pressed the shutter button, wait 30 seconds, and here's what I got. So this is another time-lapse technique that I sometimes use in my studio. I call it light painting because I'm going to be adding some light during the exposure. Now for this to work, neither the camera nor the model can move during the exposure. So I set my camera on a tripod and I ask my model to be comfortable and don't move. So I set my drive mode to self-timer because I don't want to have to touch the camera during the exposure. I set autofocus mode to 1 shot and metering evaluative, and even though I'm not going to use flash, I'm going to set white balance to flash because that'll give me this really nice orangey glow, warm feeling off her skin. And of course I shoot in RAW. ISO is going to be 100 because I'm trying to keep the noise down in this, and I want 15 seconds because it's going to give me enough time to light up parts that I want lit up. I have to go to aperture 11 to allow me to have 15 seconds. Now that I have all this set up, what I do is I focus on her, then switch to manual focus on the lens itself. Then I turn off the lights in the studio, push the shutter button, and then I just take an ordinary flashlight and just light up areas of her that I would like to have lit up. I do that for like 15 seconds and man, it's fun. And here's what I get. For this portrait I wanted a very shallow depth of field. These trees back here are just not very pretty and I wanted to just blur them out so they wouldn't be a distraction in my photograph. Now the sun was still fairly high and it's pretty much hitting her right on the top of the head, and it's actually a little bit overexposed right there, but I don't really mind that too much because it allowed me to get the rest of her face nice and clear. So I set my drive mode to single shooting, autofocus mode to 1 shot, evaluative metering, and I chose daylight for white balance to bring out the whiteness in her skin. It worked very well. And I shoot in RAW, ISO 100 to keep a nice fine grain, and I chose a large aperture, f2, to throw the background out of focus. And I ended up with shutter speed of 640 because I wanted to just overexpose it just slightly so there would be no shadows in her face and it wouldn't be dark. If I had shot this at zero compensation exposure, her face would have been darker. So I got it overexposed by about 1/3 just to brighten up her face, and like I said, that kind of just made this a little bit too bright, but it's a trade-off that I'm quite willing to live with. And this is what I got. So in this photograph I have a very small, very fast moving subject, this little hummingbird here. So what I did was I set my camera up this way, my drive mode to continuous or burst shooting, like 5-6 frames per second. Set my autofocus mode to servo because my subject is moving in every direction. I still use evaluative metering and white balance on auto. It was a pretty nice sunny day, so ISO 400 was going to give me enough speed, and I wanted to blur out the background anyway, so I chose aperture f2 and I ended up with a shutter speed of 2000 or 1/2000th of a second. And if you look closely, you'll notice that pretty much the only thing that's in focus is the head of this bird and maybe a part of the body. The fast moving wings are already starting to get a little blurry, which is just what I wanted. It depicts motion, right? And here's what I got. So here we have a larger, fast moving subject. I've still got all the settings the same as for the bird, continuous, servo, evaluative, auto, and RAW, but I bumped my ISO up to 800 because I want to use an aperture of f4 to get more depth of field. If I shot this one at f2 like I did the hummingbird, I would just get this little bit here in focus, but I didn't want that. I want the whole thing in focus right from the front to the back. And because I was quite a ways away, this photograph has been cropped. I was able to do it at f4 and 0.002 of a second. And here's what I got. So, while shooting in manual mode, we use the exposure scale and the indicator to know when we have correct exposure. When this little indicator is right in the middle, you have correct exposure. Now, using manual mode, we have to do that ourselves. One of the ways we can do that is with ISO. We can up or down the ISO number to move this scale right into the center. Another way we can do that is we use shutter speed. Faster shutter speed, we can go slower shutter speed. If we go to the minus, we'll get a darker picture. If we go to the plus, obviously we'll get a brighter picture. We can also use aperture to do that. Same thing. On the minus side, you'll have a darker picture. On the plus side, you'll have a brighter picture. These three settings are all we need to get this little guy to exactly where we want it. Sometimes you might not want it right in the middle. Maybe you want to overexpose just a little bit, so you move it over using one of these things. And that is all there is to it. Now all you have to do is decide what kind of photograph you want to make. Do you want to make everything clear and sharp and focused right from the front to infinity? Do you want to make an artistic photograph? Maybe a selective focus where the background is blurred out. Or perhaps you'd like to do a light painting. Now that you know how easy it is to shoot in manual mode, you can make any kind of photograph you want. Now go out and shoot the assignment listed on this page and upload your very best shots here and tell the whole world how you did it. And keep shooting.